Judgment Night is a 1993 action thriller movie starring Emilio Estevez, Cuba Gooding Jr., Stephen Dorff, Jeremy Piven, and Dennis Leary. It was directed by Stephen Hopkins and distributed by Universal Pictures. The film tells the story of four men who end up in a struggle for their lives after making a wrong turn in a bad part of Chicago. In the opening scene, we are introduced to the quartet of men as they board a luxury RV that Ray has managed to secure for the ride to Chicago to attend a boxing match from the nearby suburb of Evanston. You may know Evanston as the town that every person who says they are from Chicago is actually from. Anyway, en route to the boxing match, a traffic jam slows them down. Ray decides to take a detour, hoping to find a shortcut. In a derelict and destitute part of town, the men accidentally hit a pedestrian played by Michael DiLorenzo, and, while rendering aid, realize that he has a gunshot wound. In an attempt to save the man's life, the party decides to give him a ride to the hospital. However, as luck would have it, they spot a nearby police vehicle driving in the same direction as they are. While pursuing the cop car, in an attempt to flag it down, they are intentionally hit by an intervening vehicle hunting for the man. The collision causes their RV to be both inoperable and inconveniently wedged in a narrow alleyway. This allows the men pursuing Michael DiLorenzo's character, credited only as Kid, to be apprehended and executed, under the assumption that he was stealing money from his employer, a crime boss named Fallon, played by Dennis Leary. Now having witnessed the murder, our protagonists become liabilities in the eyes of Fallon, and he demands that they too be executed. The rest of the film is merely the pursuit of the four men through the streets of a rough and economically disadvantaged area of Chicago by Fallon and his henchmen until our heroes eventually dispatch of them and Fallon. Well, the heroes that remain. Sorry, Ray. But you already knew that, right? It's not a hard one to guess. The structure is formulaic, so why am I even bothering to talk about this movie at all then? Because, while it may bear some similarities to any action/crime/thriller movie of the era, it does distinguish itself in a way that I had never really noticed in films of this era before, and frankly, not many since. 1993 was sort of a strange moment for the action genre. The general shift in cultural attitudes in the 90s represented a transition period in American history. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989, followed by the official dissolution of the USSR in 1991. The war on drugs had been happening for well over 20 years, and the general fatigue of the moral panic that surrounded crack cocaine just didn't hit the same way that it used to. Which is actually quite ironic, as moral panics tend to have the same life cycle as drug addiction, in the sense that some people will always need something that hits harder as time goes on, to the detriment of social connections and their own standard of living. And also, like drugs, moral panics go through cycles of popularity. For instance, I'm deeply shocked that the satanic panic that I grew up with has been so effectively recycled by the mainstream today. We've learned nothing from the decades prior. Anyway, all of this is to say that, with the two main pillars that shape the genre being either completely toppled or severely eroded, there was not much left for action films to exploit. And as a slight detour, I'm not going to lie and pretend that nothing happened in the United States between 1991 and 1993. After all, 1992 was the year of the Rodney King riots. I was rather young when it happened, and the older and older I get, it seems like a moment in time that everyone just wants to forget, because the implications of actually examining it is just too uncomfortable to face. We're a nation of cowards when it comes to confronting our collective history as a country and truly reckoning with it. The most the mainstream news media of the time could ever do to address it was to broadcast images of a city on fire and stoke the fears of white Americans, especially playing the horrendous beating of Reginald Denny on every news show by a group of black men, while choosing less to focus on the fact that Reginald Denny was also saved by a group of black men. In addition, the incuriosity and callousness towards the LA riots was further fueled by pop culture writ large for treating Rodney King's pleas for peace as some sort of laughable demand. It actually became a punchline and was often mocked during the time.
Can't we all just get along?
Why can't we all just get along?
Can't we all just get along?
The point I'm trying to make is that art is a reflection of its creator, not of history. While genres like action and horror are great devices to examine larger social issues or cultural anxieties, it's important to always remember that, first and foremost, art is created by people who are equally flawed and biased as you and I. And let's be extremely honest here, Hollywood writers' rooms are dominated by people who grew up comfortable, who graduated from elite universities, who are mostly male, mostly white, and because of the way our society is crafted, have the luxury of examining its inequities and injustices at their own leisure. That is, they so often don't. They just don't. Because of this, there is a dearth of fictionalizations, let alone examinations or even metaphor for one of the most traumatic cultural moments of the 1990s. I'm not ignoring the historical importance of the 1992 LA riots, but at the same time, I cannot help that pop culture, for the most part, did and continues to do so. As such, I don't think it's important to place within the context of the film Judgment Night, but I also don't want to contribute to that silence and pretend it never happened. And as I was alluding to earlier, history, art, media, these are all separate disciplines with different standards and purposes. There are times they intersect, certainly, but they are not always in conversation with the other. I think this is simply worth saying because as I've become more interested in YouTube, I am noticing that amongst some creators who analyze media and pop culture that there's this sort of misassumption or maybe even a willful delusion that if you didn't see something portrayed or mentioned in a movie, TV show, or video game before, then it simply just never existed and therefore is somehow impossible to have ever happened, or in some cases ever will happen. As a further illustration, the 90s saw a resurgence of anti-Arab sentiment brought on by an increased campaign of U.S. interventionism in the Middle East, resulting in the unfortunate blowback that was the 1993 World Trade Center bombings and the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. While, at the same time, domestic terrorism rose as survivalists and militiamen turned their quote-unquote anti-communist fervor inward on the United States and its government, as there was no longer a Soviet Union to direct their fear and anger towards. Yet, our most popular portrayals of terrorism are almost always focused on the foreign threat of some ambiguous Middle Eastern origin, despite the greater and more statistically deadly threat being white and domestic. And not to derail things too much, when I say anti-communist, it has a unique connotation in regards to U.S. hegemony, though this dog whistle does also have some foothold in the parlance of other parts of the world, in particular other U.S. allied countries. Most people who are quote-unquote anti-communist in the American sense don't even know what communism is, nor do they actually care about combating it. Rather, communism to them is just this catch-all term meant to weaponize the fear of all social change. Social change that would inevitably challenge white, Christian, cis-male, heterosexual dominance in society. And I guess to open another can of worms, I know when I say Christian that's a pretty ambiguous term. America has a lot of different sects and denominations of Christianity, all of which thinks the other version of it is invalid, if not evil. So if you're one of those weirdos that thinks they want to live in a country where Christianity is the official religion, I have extremely bad news for you, because it's probably not going to be the version of Christianity that you believe in. But anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Anyway, back to 1993 itself, or rather movies of the action genre made to be released in 1993. They did not really have the same particular anxieties of the Red Scare or the drug war to struggle with during their creation. Action films were now tasked with finding new fears to explore, and much like the militia movement types that began to turn their aggression inwards, so too did the action film. As such, we had action films that not so subtly commented on the relevancy of the genre as a whole, and began to interrogate its own need to exist. Films like Demolition Man and Last Action Hero involve protagonists that are thrust into the world that they do not know nor understand for the sole purpose of fixing a problem from which their respective worlds are responsible for creating. And thus, the conclusion of these films are symbolic acts intended to atone for the wrongs of the past and, in a way, undo their own legacies for the benefit of future generations. It is in this vein of action film revisionism that Judgment Night finds itself. It still contains some of the evergreen conservative fears, like cities are scary. However, the core of its conflict is centered around masculinity itself. It isn't a screed against degeneracy, nor it is some revenge fantasy. Our protagonists actually spend the entirety of the film attempting to avoid conflict, and before I go further, I know the plot of Judgment Night is basically lifted from Deliverance, which was a 1972 thriller starring Burt Reynolds that also involves four friends trying to survive violent locals in a setting that is unfamiliar to them. Swap the backwoods of northern Georgia for the projects of Chicago, and they're almost the same. Hell, even one of the four protagonists dies. However, even with the lifted plot points of Deliverance, Judgment Night does not have the same message. Whereas the hill folk of Deliverance are avatars of nature's attempt to defend the untamed wilderness against the threat of civilization to reshape it in the image of man, Fallon and his merry band of thugs in Judgment Night are more over-the-top comic book villains who have an almost supernatural ability to track down our protagonists at the most inopportune of moments.
It must be them. They're here.
That is because the only purpose the villains serve in this movie is to stir an internal dialogue in each one of our heroes about what it means to be a man. In one scene, the character Mike lays the thesis of the movie bare.
Always wondered how I'd do in combat.
It's a question that all men ask themselves, and is fortunately a question most of us never truly have to answer. That isn't to say I'm against exploring that, if you're so inclined. As I've stated in an earlier video, I do have some experience with combat sports. I think martial arts are a perfectly reasonable pursuit, and that the knowledge of them is overall a positive. It can help demystify a lot of the basic mechanics of physical violence in a way that can be both enlightening and frightening. You will simultaneously learn how strong a person can be, but also how frail the human body is from the safer confines of a managed environment. I will caution that a lot of the martial arts world does tend to lean into authoritarianism because of the amount of discipline and deference to authority that is required to learn. I do have quite a few takes on this, but I'll save a lot of my thoughts about the intersection of politics and martial arts for another video. I'll just say that there are a lot of fascists and authoritarians in martial arts, but martial arts do not automatically make one a fascist. I know that can be an unpopular opinion in the North American left as a whole, but let's face it, a lot of American Canadian left exists more as a soapbox for righteously indignant but ultimately toothless criticism, rather than acting as a counterweight to center-right and right-wing governance. Anyway, with masculinity being the central theme of the film, we're given different versions of how men perform said masculinity. And I will emphasize the word perform here because masculinity is a performance. It's something that demands an audience. Firstly, we have John, played by Stephen Dorff, who's the younger brother of Frank and represents an almost childlike view of masculinity. He puts up a tough facade in the earlier portions of the film by trying to start a random fight, emboldened by the notion that he and his friends outnumber a potential rival. However, when faced with the actual prospect of conflict where the stakes of life and death are clearly outlined and the odds are less certain, he freezes and is unable to perform. This isn't to say that a readiness to do violence is what makes a man, but it does mean that in his own conception of what masculinity is, he has failed. However, it is only when Mike is shot and injured in the final showdown does John really understand that bravery and machismo are two separate things. At the threat to his own life, he makes an effort to help Mike to safety, and even getting shot in the process. Unlike John, Mike, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., does have a readiness to do violence. However, his eagerness leads to unnecessary risks, and Mike represents a more youthful and carefree approach. While he does care for his friends, it's clear he's motivated entirely by the thrill of it all. A nihilistic death drive that not only risks his life, but those of his friends. And, perhaps, if Frank was not there to guide all the men, John and Mike may have never made it out alive. And speaking of, Frank, played by Emilio Estevez, serves as the fully idealized version of masculinity. He is a father, husband, and older brother. He exhibits a calmness under pressure and steady leadership that guides his friends, or what's left of them by the end of the film, to make it out alive. He's all virtue, no vice. I know in our current day there's a very odd backlash against decency in general. While the insult is less fashionable these days, I do remember a time when people would just accuse another of quote-unquote virtue signaling, and then they would do so with this unearned sense of self-satisfaction and think that just by saying so, it was enough to quote-unquote win an exchange. And I say unearned because being kind and considerate to others is actually pretty hard. It's something that requires work and discipline. Being selfish and inconsiderate is actually the easiest and laziest thing a person can do. Simply noticing that someone is trying to do better isn't a deep observation, nor should it work as a meaningful insult. And even though those people just don't declare someone as virtue signaling anymore with the same regularity, the notion that it is somehow quote-unquote more authentic to just be immature and greedy has yet to fade from our culture. And with that being said, this finally brings me to Ray, who is played by Jeremy Piven. Ray represents a more superficial vision of masculinity that concerns itself with material acquisition as a means of signaling their manhood to the rest of the world. While materialism is not unique to men, it does often manifest differently in men, as men rarely have ambitions for luxury outside of what that luxury means to other people. That is, it's a masculinity concerned with collecting various trophies intended to make a specific kind of man jealous and attract a specific kind of woman. This very attitude is actually what leads to his own death. As a slick-talking salesman, Ray has deluded himself into believing that everything is negotiable and that everything has a price.
Excuse me for a minute. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but, didn't you say something about money?
Yeah, I did.
And as he tries to convince Fallon and his gang to stop their pursuit of him and his friends, he is immediately brought back down to earth, quite literally, and disabused of his delusion that money can fix everything. It's actually a minor theme throughout the movie. There are a few incidents throughout the film that expresses a sentiment that can be seen as anti-materialist. However, it isn't presented in a way that is meant to criticize the broader dynamics of capital. Rather, in many ways it reinforces the concept of capital as a symptom of civility. Money to the gangsters throughout the film is actually treated as a secondary concern. Even the initial betrayal that causes the murder that our protagonists witness is more about trust than money. It's not because they are idealistic or principled, but rather, money represents a degree of civility, and the inability for the men to be bought is not a sign of integrity. Rather, it is a symptom of their inhumanity and lack of reason. In one of the initial scenes where the men are fleeing the gangsters, they find themselves in a rail car with a bunch of homeless men who threaten to give away their position. The men attempt to buy their silence with whatever they have on them, money, clothes, jewelry. For a moment, it works. However, one of the homeless men begins to have a mental episode and is unable to control himself and begins acting erratically, not only breaking the contract that the money represents, but compromising the protagonists by giving away their position to Fallon and his crew. In this sense, money's relationship to civil society is further reinforced, and it says to the audience that impoverished areas and therefore impoverished people deserve their fate, as they're just filled with people that are incapable of truly grasping the concept of money appropriately. I will say this message is not completely consistent throughout the film. There is actually this one heavy-handed moment.
Yeah.
Money got blood on it, man.
You ever seen any that didn't?
But I kind of believe this was improvised by Dennis Leary and just kept in the film. For those of you too young to remember, or maybe even too old to remember, Dennis Leary was a stand-up comedian turned actor whose gimmick was being this acerbic, fast-talking, chain-smoking misanthrope who straddled the line between being a manic street preacher and some streetwise professor who was always on the cusp of collapsing under the weight of his own genius. There's even a scene in the movie where he is allowed to do his bit and just sort of vamp.
Okay? Nothing. Guys like you gotta keep checking your pants to see if you got a dick. I got one. You and your friends are the kind of spoon-fed fucking fruit bait that I fucking hate! You know who we are? No, you have no fucking idea, do you? No, chicks like you just sail through life reading about people like me in the newspaper. Hey! You're in a different place now, motherfucker.
It was just something we expected of him at the time, especially in 1993, which was obviously a great year for Dennis Leary. The rants sort of stemmed from his stand-up, but more importantly to me, they came from a series of interstitial skits he did for MTV. And speaking of MTV, I also don't want it to go unsaid that Everlast, credited by his birth name, Eric Schrody, plays the last goon that must be handled before Fallon is finally confronted. And for those who are not old enough to remember, or perhaps even too old to ever know, Everlast is a musician who first came to prominence with the rap group House of Pain, whose breakthrough single, Jump Around, was released the year prior in 1992. While not the first white rapper to ever exist, the success of Jump Around was part of a broader cultural moment when the lines between rap and rock were being blurred, at least in a commercial sense. The majority of support for both genres has always come from mostly white, suburban youth, so it just felt natural to combine the two from a marketing standpoint. And I don't know if the casting of Eric Schrody informed the production of the soundtrack or the other way around, but I feel like I would be remiss not to mention that the Judgment Night soundtrack was a pretty seminal moment in the continued fusion of rap into rock, and vice versa, with the music created specifically for the album combining some of the most well-known names in rock and rap at the time. But let's get back to Frank and the idealized form of masculinity he represents. I'm sure the trope has another more established name that I can't think of at this moment, but in my head I've always referred to this type of hero that Frank is as the sleeping dragon. The sleeping dragon is a power fantasy that unfortunately most men do have. Perhaps it's culturally informed, or maybe it is some innate part of us that is a holdover from our evolutionary history, but there's a belief that too many men have regarding how they would react in a life or death situation. There's a delusion that a lot of men have that when pushed past a certain point that he'll just rise to the occasion and overcome any obstacle put in his way. It's a belief that man's quote-unquote natural inclination to violence will allow him to prevail, regardless of actual skill or chance. Even though, in reality, you will be facing other men who arguably have the same beast within. I don't know. It's solipsistic and self-serving, but it's a fantasy. It doesn't need to be rational. Again, learning other people exist to the same degree of complexity that you do actually takes a lot of effort to even acknowledge, but it also requires a lot of work to maintain an awareness of, because kindness and empathy are disciplines that require continued practice. As a point of illustration, even after Ray is murdered, Frank, as the leader of the crew of protagonists, is more concerned with the safety of his remaining friends than he is with confronting Fallon and extracting revenge. It's only when he's finally out of options that he's forced to take on Fallon and unleash the beast, as it were. Without the guardrails of Frank's own civility and kindness no longer keeping him from being the violent animal that he truly is, that all men are, or, well, that all men wish to believe themselves to be, Frank is able to finally meet Fallon at his level and invest him in the most primitive contest of survival, hand-to-hand combat. While he's done all he can to avoid conflict, he is no less adept at dispensing physical violence than his adversary. In a sense, this is Frank not only tapping into the past he's alluded to having in the earlier portions of the film, but tapping into the primal nature of every conflict that had to be won for him to exist in this very moment. This is where the film tries to make this distinction between violence that's good versus violence that is bad. Fallon's violent actions are uncivilized and animalistic and in service of selfish ends, whereas Frank's violence is used to protect those he loves and is only ever used as a means of last resort. Unlike other heroes of the action movie genre, Frank exercises restraint at every opportunity he is able. Even before Fallon falls to his death, Frank does make an attempt to save him. Even with the murder of his friend and the potential life-threatening injuries inflicted upon the remainder of those in his group, Frank still extends mercy to Fallon. Frank is, as the movie keeps implying, civilized after all. He knows that it's not his place to decide who lives or dies, and I will agree that had Fallon lived and faced justice, it wouldn't be a satisfying ending, but what's often emotionally satisfying on a primitive level and what's morally right are rarely the same thing. This is why I think the movie's message of a kind, nurturing, enlightened ideal of masculinity is compelling and worth noting, even if it is a bit muddled and did not resonate with the audiences of the time. Well, that's it, I guess. I know I said I'd try to be more consistent in my release schedule, but life is, in the way so often. But, I am still enjoying this. So if you would like me to get me to a point where I have an incentive to keep releasing these, please like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.